Tell me someone in this building can fix a decaying orbit in the next 4 hours. Vivian Castellan said it standing, not sitting, both palms flat on the conference table, staring at a screen that showed a $4 million satellite drifting 6 degrees off its corrected path. Nobody answered her. 11 engineers, 3 propulsion specialists, a whiteboard covered in failed math. Silence. Down on the ground floor, a man in a gray uniform was running a buffer over the lobby tile, waiting for his name to be called from a stack of janitorial applications nobody had read past the first line. Vivian had read his, twice. Marcus Riley. She knew that name. She'd built half her early trajectory models off a paper with that name on it 14 years ago, before the author disappeared from every conference, every faculty list, every place a man like that should have been impossible to lose. She hadn't connected it to the application on her desk until an assistant mentioned almost in passing that the new custodial hire had asked for the night shift specifically, said it suited his schedule with his daughter. Vivian sat back down. Looked at the orbital decay curve still climbing on the screen. Looked at the door. Somewhere 2 floors below her, a man who used to solve problems like this one for a living was emptying a trash can outside the server room and had no idea that the woman running this company had just said his name out loud in a room of people who had no idea who he used to be. Marcus Riley's day started at 5:40 a.m., the same time it had started for 3 years, ever since it became just him and Pia. He made her lunch before he made his own coffee. Turkey sandwich, cut diagonal because she said triangles tasted better than rectangles, and he stopped arguing with 9-year-old logic a long time ago. He checked her backpack for the permission slip she'd forgotten twice that week. He walked her 2 blocks to the bus stop and waited until the doors closed before he turned back toward his car, because that was the rule he had made for himself, and he didn't break his own rules. He worked the night shift at Castellan Aerodyne, 8 at night to 4 in the morning, so he could be the one who packed lunches and waited at bus stops. The pay was modest, the hours were exact. Nobody asked him to stay late or come in early, and that predictability was worth more to him than anything else the job didn't offer. He never mentioned the degree, never mentioned the paper. When the HR coordinator had glanced at his application and asked carefully why someone with his background wanted to push a mop cart, he'd said only that he needed work that ended when it said it would end. He ate dinner alone at 11, standing at the break room counter, because the cafeteria closed at 9, and he didn't mind. He nodded to the security guard, Hal Brennan, every night without fail. He kept a small notebook in his back pocket, and sometimes in the dead quiet of the server room hallway, he'd take it out and write something down. An equation, half finished, the way another man might hum a tune stuck in his head. Nobody noticed him long enough to ask what it meant.
It started with a sound. Marcus was buffing the floor outside the satellite operations room a little after midnight when he heard it through the wall. Not an alarm, nothing that urgent, just a recurring tone from a workstation someone had left running. 3 short pulses, a pause, 3 short pulses again. The kind of thing an engineer working a 16-hour day stops hearing after the 2nd hour. He didn't stop because it was loud. He stopped because of the rhythm. He stood there a moment, cart handle still in his hand, listening the way a man listens to an engine idle wrong before he can say exactly why. 3 pulses, even spacing, then a pause that was very slightly shorter than the pause before it, shrinking, not by much, but shrinking. He knew that pattern. He'd built systems that made that exact sound years ago, when a correction algorithm hit a feedback loop it couldn't break out of on its own. He didn't go in. It wasn't his door to walk through, not at midnight, not in a gray uniform with a buffer cord still wrapped around his shoulder. He noted the time. He finished the hallway. On his break, he wrote 4 lines in his notebook. Not a solution, just the shape, the outline of a problem he suspected was forming somewhere on the other side of that wall. The next night, the tone was still going, faster now. He mentioned it once, carefully, to a night shift propulsion tech named Joel who was grabbing coffee in the break room. Said it almost like a question, not a warning. That tone in ops, anybody looking at the interval on that? Joe laughed, not unkindly. It's a known glitch. Web team's already on it. You'd be surprised how much weird noise this place makes at 2 a.m. Marcus nodded, said nothing more, and went back to his cart. But he kept listening, and the pause kept shrinking. By Thursday morning, the tone Marcus had been tracking for 3 nights had stopped being a curiosity and become a headline. The decaying satellite Vivian Castellian had been staring at in the conference room wasn't just drifting anymore. Its correction thrusters had started firing in short, erratic bursts, burning fuel reserves the company couldn't afford to lose before the next scheduled window. Russ Tanner, director of ground operations, stood at the head of the war room with his sleeves rolled and his confidence fully intact. He'd been doing this 19 years. He told the room, and later told Vivian directly, that it was a sensor calibration issue. Nothing structural, nothing in the core correction logic. His team had already isolated what they believed was a faulty input from one of the ground tracking stations and were recalibrating accordingly. The data on the surface agreed with him. The error showed up cleanest at the sensor layer. Recalibrating it smoothed the readout almost immediately. Tanner called it fixed by 9 a.m. and told Vivian as much in a hallway conversation that lasted 90 seconds. Vivian wanted to believe him. The board wanted to believe him. The fix was clean, fast, and came from the most experienced man in the building. But 3 hours later, the tone came back. Different sensor, same rhythm. Tanner adjusted his theory, said it was a secondary calibration drift, a known issue with the tracking array in cold weather, something his team had handled before. He recalibrated again. The room exhaled. Vivian did not. She had learned, over 14 years of running a company that lived or died on physics rather than opinion, that confidence and correctness were not the same thing, and that the men in this building who were the most certain were not always the men who were right. Down 2 floors, on his break, Marcus opened his notebook to the 4 lines he'd written Tuesday night and added a 5th. He didn't know yet that what Tanner was calling a sensor problem wasn't sitting in the sensors at all. He just knew the pause between pulses was still shrinking.
By Thursday afternoon, the 3rd recalibration had failed exactly the way the first 2 had. A few hours of quiet, then the tone again, the pause a little shorter each time. Tanner was no longer talking about sensor drift. He'd stopped explaining the failures out loud at all, which Vivian had learned over the years was its own kind of answer. Marcus finished his rotation early that night and went to the break room instead of going home. He sat with his notebook open under the fluorescent light and worked backward from what he already knew. The tone wasn't an input error. Input errors didn't shrink on a clean interval. They spiked, scattered, behaved like noise. This behaved like math, like a correction function feeding its own output back into itself, tightening with each cycle, the way a system does right before it loses the ability to correct at all. If he was right, the problem wasn't in what the satellite was sensing. It was in how the satellite was deciding what to do with what it sensed, buried somewhere in the optimization logic itself, the part of the system nobody had touched because nobody suspected it. He didn't have access to the architecture. He didn't need it. He had 4 years of writing systems almost exactly like this one, back when his name was on conference programs instead of a custodial badge, and a memory that hadn't dulled after a decade of warehouses and night shifts. He wrote the shape of it on a fresh page, not the company's formula, his own, a reconstruction of what a formula like it would have to look like to produce this exact failure. 7 lines, a feedback term that should have been bounded and wasn't. He sat with it for a long moment, marker, no pen, still in his hand, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time: certainty. He thought about closing the notebook and finishing his shift like any other night. Then he thought about the $4 million drifting further off course with every hour Tanner spent recalibrating the wrong layer of the problem, and he put the notebook in his back pocket and walked toward the stairs instead of the elevator, because the stairs were faster, and for the first time in years, speed mattered again. The war room on the 7th floor on the 7th was still full at 11 that night. Vivian hadn't sent anyone home, and nobody had asked to go home. Tanner was at the whiteboard, 2 markers deep into a 4th theory, when the door opened and a man in a gray uniform stepped halfway into the room and stopped. Nobody noticed him for a few seconds. Then a junior analyst near the window did and said, not unkindly, just confused, "Can we help you?" "I think I know what's wrong with the correction logic," Marcus said. The room didn't laugh, not quite, but the silence that followed had the texture of people deciding whether to be polite about something. Tanner turned from the whiteboard with the marker still in his hand and said, "This is a closed session." Vivian, who was sitting at the far end of the table with her coat still on, because she hadn't planned on staying this late either, looked up. She looked at the man in the doorway for a long moment, then at the badge clipped to his uniform, then back at his face. Marcus Riley, the name she'd read twice on an application 3 weeks ago and never managed to forget. "Let him in," she said. Tanner started to object. Vivian didn't raise her voice. "Let him in, Russ." Marcus crossed the room without hurry, pulled the small notebook from his back pocket, and asked for a marker. Someone handed him one without thinking about it. He found a clear corner of the whiteboard, the same way a man finds a clear stretch of counter when he already knows exactly what he's about to cook, and he wrote 7 lines, not Tanner's notation, his own, but translatable enough that within 4 lines the lead propulsion engineer had gone very still. "The feedback term," Marcus said, tapping the 3rd line. "It's not bounded. Every correction cycle, it's feeding back into itself a little tighter. That's not a sensor problem. The sensors are reading the satellite correctly. The satellite's reading itself wrong." Nobody spoke. Tanner's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue because the math on the board was already doing the arguing for him. "Run it," Vivian said. It took the engineering team 11 minutes to apply the bound Marcus had written and push the correction. The tone, the one nobody but Marcus had been tracking for 3 nights, stopped. The thruster bursts evened out. On the main screen, the decay curve flattened, then began slowly to climb back toward its corrected path. The room exhaled all at once, the particular silence of relief that hasn't figured out what to say yet. Marcus capped the marker, set it down, and looked briefly like a man who'd already started thinking about getting back to his cart. "Wait," Vivian said.
Vivian didn't let him leave that night. She had the engineering team pull the full correction architecture up on screen and asked Marcus plainly to look at where the unbounded term had come from in the first place. Bugs like that didn't usually write themselves into a system that had been running clean for 2 years. It took him 40 minutes to find it, and what he found wasn't a mistake. The feedback term had been altered 8 months earlier, buried inside a routine optimization update. A change that on paper looked like a minor efficiency improvement. It shaved processing load by a small defensible margin. It also removed the safety bound that kept the correction function from feeding back into itself under exactly the conditions the satellite had just hit. The update had Tanner's department sign off on it. Tanner himself hadn't written the code. A contractor had. Under a deadline Tanner's team had pushed up by 6 weeks to hit a client incentive bonus tied to system performance benchmarks. The bound had been flagged in an internal review as a non-critical simplification. Nobody above the contractor had checked the math closely enough to know what non-critical actually meant under the right failure conditions. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't malice. It was a corner cut by people in a hurry, signed off on by a man who trusted his own experience more than he trusted a junior reviewer's hesitation, 8 months before anyone had reason to think it mattered. But it meant every satellite running that optimization branch, 11 of them across 3 client contracts, carried the same unbounded term, waiting for the same conditions to trip it. Vivian sat with that for a long moment, looking at the architecture diagram, then at Tanner, who had gone very quiet, then at Marcus, who hadn't said a word about blame and didn't seem inclined to start. "How many of the 11 are close to those conditions?" she asked. 3, Marcus said.
within the month if nobody touches them. Vivian looked at the clock. It was past 1 in the morning. She thought about the board members who'd be asking by sunrise how a janitor had just found something 19 years of operations experience had missed for 8 months, and what that question was actually going to cost the people who'd dismissed him in the meantime. By Monday, all 3 satellites were corrected, quietly, methodically, with Marcus working alongside the engineering team, not in front of them, not above them, just beside them, the way he'd always preferred it. The board found out everything. Vivian made sure of it. She walked into that meeting with the architecture diagram, the timeline of the 8-month-old update, and the 7 lines Marcus had written on a whiteboard at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, and she laid it out without softening any of it, including the part where her own director of ground operations had pushed a deadline that created the gap, and the part where the man who found it had been wearing a janitor's badge while he did. She didn't ask the board's permission for what came next. She told them what she'd already decided. Tanner resigned 2 weeks later. Nobody forced the timing of it, and nobody needed to. The math made its own case, the way it always does when you let it. Vivian called a full staff meeting that Friday. Every department, the auditorium on the 2nd floor packed past its chairs. She told them about the satellite. She told them about the tone nobody else had been listening for, and the 3 nights a man on the night shift had tracked it without anyone asking him to. She didn't dramatize it. She just told them plainly that the company had a structural blind spot in how it valued expertise, and that blind spot had nearly cost them 11 satellites and 3 client contracts before a man with a buffer cart and a mathematics degree decided to walk through an open door. Marcus Riley will be joining our propulsion systems team as senior analyst, effective immediately. She didn't ask him to stand. She'd learned enough about him by then to know he wouldn't have wanted that. But somewhere in the back of the auditorium, Hal Brennan, who'd nodded at Marcus every night for 3 years without ever asking why a man like that was pushing a cart, started clapping anyway. Delia Okonkwo, 2 rows up, joined him. It moved through the room the way these things do, not loud, not performative, just steady, the way you clap for something you didn't know you'd been waiting to see. Marcus stood near the back wall, hands in his pockets, and didn't say anything at all.
Castellan Aerodyne changed in ways that didn't make the headlines, but mattered more than the ones that would have. Vivian instituted a new review protocol for every optimization update, a second set of eyes, no deadline allowed to override it, no matter whose bonus was tied to the timeline. She didn't name it after the satellite. She didn't need to. Everyone who'd been in the building that week knew exactly where the policy came from. Marcus took the role on his own terms. No corner office, a desk near a window on the 4th floor, close enough to the propulsion team that he could hear what they were working on without needing to be asked into the room. He still packed Pia's lunch every morning, still cut the sandwich diagonal, still walked her to the bus stop and waited for the doors to close before he turned around. The job changed. The life underneath it didn't, because the life underneath it had never been the problem. He kept the mop. It sat in the closet of his apartment for almost a year before Pia found it while looking for a broom and asked him, with the bluntness only a 10-year-old has, why he still had it. "Because I'm not done with it," he told her, which didn't fully answer the question, and she let it go the way kids do when an answer feels complete even if it isn't. He and Vivian never talked much about the 20 years in between, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some things, once understood, don't need to be revisited out loud. She'd see him sometimes in the hallway, notebook in his back pocket, and she'd think about a calculus classroom and a man who'd never once made her feel small for not keeping up, and she'd think that some debts get repaid, not with a single grand gesture, but with quiet, ordinary fairness, applied consistently for as long as it takes.
The tone in the server room never came back, but sometimes, late at night, when the building was nearly empty and a junior engineer was working past a problem they couldn't crack, they'd see a light on in the fourth-floor office and know that if they knocked, someone would answer who wouldn't make them feel foolish for asking. The most valuable people are often the ones nobody notices first. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, have you ever known someone whose worth took the world too long to see?